Okay, so we're back, and this time we're going to be putting foliage in conjunction with cliff faces. We're going to be kind of expounding upon the principles that we had talked about earlier in the first two videos. So here I've already created a cliff face, and we have a little bit of a hill behind it. So we'll show how to kind of mix this all in together. And one of the main parts of this video will be the kind of an introduction to using foliage to hide some of the more poor looking aspects of RCT. So in the case of cliffs, it's going to be these corners. Um, in real life, you don't really see these perfectly right-angled corners of cliffs. It's much more smooth. So those are the areas that we're going to kind of want to hide with our foliage. Obviously, we're not going to be tackling every single nook and cranny of this because we don't want a repetitive pattern of always having foliage in these corners. The one thing, if we have this, and aside from foliage, if we have one of these bare, we're going to be wanting to kind of include some quarter blocks, which are also custom scenery objects, and that will kind of help just a little bit to smooth that out, even if we have it bare. So we're going to be using some different trees for this one, just to give a couple examples of other trees, but we'll start with our same principles and put that here in the context of the cliff. So I almost always use a paintbrush to start laying out where the trees are going to go. So let's target some of these corners. Let's keep this one open like we've already plotted here. So we know we're going to put probably our largest tree right against that so we can block that out. We'll also do the same. We'll hit this one. This one's kind of coming down, so we might blend that in with some landscaping, but we'll come around the back side of this and start spilling that out onto the rest of the hill. Keeping in what we've done with the previous ones, let's cover the bottom of the hill like so. So we practice what we preach here, and we're going to be targeting the bottom of the hill to put our foliage. And then let's do something similar on this side. We might hide this as a kind of a longer straight face, so we want to also break that up, and that would be a perfect opportunity to put a couple trees over here. And this one we might have come out a little bit further, maybe wrap around the edge. So let's just get this kind of put in place here. And then we'll kind of follow what we've done previously on this back side. And we'll just follow the contour a little bit, and we'll be filling that in as well. So before we kind of start fleshing these areas out, we know we're going to want to spill a little bit of this up onto the top of the cliff. So we know we're going to be putting primarily shrubs that span from here, at the bottom of the cliff to the top of the cliff, just to kind of integrate everything. Gives it a nice look. We'll also do the same at this point, and we'll start spilling onto the top of this hill. So now let's flesh out these areas down here. So we know we're going to include some of it like this. These are going to be a little bit smaller, so let's come down to just our individual tile paintbrush. Start making these look a little bit nicer. And now, like we did in previous videos, let's kind of shape these up to look a little bit more fluid, more organic. Including these back ones, bring it off the top of the cliff just a little bit, or the hill rather here. Here we might have like kind of an open area in between. Let's give this a little bit nicer of a curve there. And give this one also a little bit of an appearance. I might have this also kind of break in half. We'll experiment a little bit with shrubs having a kind of a secondary shape to them in this video. So let's do something like that. And let's start filling this in. Let's follow the same principles that we used earlier here, using our tallest trees in the middle. It's kind of the best plug and chug method. On these corners of the cliff, we want something not necessarily tallest, but something that's going to be nice and full. Here I chose the red land texture just to exemplify where the trees are, because they'll pop out in this. And then also this gray rock, so we can clearly see the cliff when we're done. Obviously, in your work, it's going to be whatever you want. So I want something kind of tropical, maybe a little bit more lush than we had done previously. So let's find a nice big tree that can go or thick tree that can go and hide that corner. So let's just repeat that over here. Now that we have those, let's start adding our tallest, which I think will be this palm tree. And this will typically be more against the cliffs. And we'll put this in the center of this form of trees. This one will be right in the center of that. And let's call it at that. Now let's start getting into our secondary trees here. This is a taller one that also looks kind of tropical. I can't put this on. Not flat land though, so let's use something different. Maybe something like this. Actually, let's use this guy. Let's go for a little bit more of a variety approach to what trees we're using. Again here, we're using the tallest trees. I like to put those next to each other if possible to give it just a little bit more shape to it. Or at least an additional shape that it wouldn't otherwise. So let's include those. Now let's start walking down to shorter and shorter trees. We want to keep it pretty tropical. It might have a couple more additional colors than I typically would work with. But that's okay here. It's not a hard and fast rule. Here's another example. Let's block that corner off. And put some of these guys down. So we'll be having several kind of looks here. Kind of this light olive with this more faded type of green. Just fleshing out these shapes a little bit. Again, same principles with the hills. Let's come off the hill with its own shape. Something along those lines. I think I'll add this. This one looks a little bit more tropical. Works really well when we put these trees right against the cliff face. Something like that. Now I'm going to rotate this to see how we're doing over here. Here again, we're going to have our two larger forms shaping up, which generally looks a little bit nicer than having it all as one giant mass. Okay, now we're kind of getting towards the end of our tree, so let's go with this juniper tree. Kind of start getting these curves looking a little bit more complete. Okay, doing pretty well on these. Let's finish that one up. Include some over here, and that'll pretty much do it for the trees that we're going to use for this video. Now let's go in with our shrubs. We'll start with kind of what we've done earlier, but then we'll start playing with adding some of those secondary forms like we did, spilling up onto this tree, but we'll also do some of those down here. So I have this jungle bush. This is my favorite one to do lush foliage with. So we'll disable our clearance checks, and we'll use this one to be our kind of primary one underneath our trees. Again, we're sticking with kind of this more full look that we see in parks now. And obviously when we add this, you can see it's quickly shaping up to be much more lush and full when we add these bushes. But we want to be careful not to add too many of these. These will start to form large masses of trees, which I don't necessarily want in this case. Okay, and then we'll start blending these in a little bit more so that it doesn't look so obviously scattered with these. We are going to spill a couple of these up onto the top of the cliff like we had marked out, so let's go ahead and start that. Okay, the fern's another one that's great for kind of these tropical looking areas. This is a custom scenery object. So let's keep following what we were doing, how we marked this out. Let's go hit that. Again, as you can see, we're keeping the top of this hill open so we can get the shape of the hill more. But we kind of want it to look a little bit mysterious with how we're covering things up with our foliage. Okay, and just filling this guy out. And once we get our grasses in here, this will look much more complete. And that's our next one that we'll do. Let's put a couple ferns spilling up here. If I can get it off the rock, there we go. Alright, now this time I'm actually going to go off the scatter tool and do this by hand. Because we're going to start adding these kind of secondary shapes. So you can think of it as kind of like a big spiral, kind of like a fractal. So we're getting a little bit more interesting here with what we're doing. Deviating from the main shape that we put, adding a little bit more uniqueness, some extra flavors in there. Again, this is especially effective when we're spilling up onto the top of hills. So let's be sure to include some of that. So again, you're starting to see some of these smaller shapes, but we're still having the large curve that we started with our trees. So primarily we're doing this with grasses and shrubs. Alright, now we just have a few more areas to do that. Let's get the top of these that's spilling over. Ease up over there just a tad. Alright, and we're starting to get this guy looking more complete. Just filling in our last areas of these grasses. You want these to sort of connect, but they also have their own shape, so keep that in mind. And we're clicking a lot because we're doing these individually, but it also gives me a little bit more control over where the grass is actually going. But as you can see, we're getting a lot of extra shapes in here. Okay, and the last thing we're going to do is the same thing we've done earlier, is start to knock back some of these straight edges that we can clearly see to make sure things look nice and smooth like you would find in actual nature. You don't want too much of a grid appearance here. So we did something pretty lush, so we actually didn't have too many of those to knock back. But here you can see the main idea of this video is these little sections, covering these corners that look a little bit more rough. We could have covered this corner as well, but I just wanted to throw in a little aside with throwing in those quarter blocks, which is very useful for breaking up that harsh 90-degree angle. Also like to spill this out, depending on the height of your cliff. If you have room, spilling some on top of the cliff face will also add a little bit extra dimensionality to things. Otherwise, we just kind of continued on these same principles that we talked about with the hill here, that we translated over here, and then we started adding secondary shapes with our bushes. In this case, we use a lot of grass here. Alright, thanks for tuning in.